Good day, everyone. My name is Johnny Burwise. Thank you for spending half an hour with me to learn about digitization of environmental governance in China. During this presentation, you will learn how China is transforming into a eco-civilization, how digitization is used to accelerate this, how crises are used to engage the population into this transformation, and finally, I will explain how companies in China can leverage this for business. I will then illustrate some examples and share more sources for you to study. First, I will take you quickly back in time to understand how governance and enforcement in China works. Next, I will explain the paradigm shifts that have been happening here and take a leap into the future. Finally, I will give you a few thoughts to ponder about before you go to sleep tonight. My goal is to give you an on-ground view on how China is changing and how this offers opportunities. Let's first take a look back. China's development is driven centrally by the Chinese government by means of 5-year plans. During those 5 years, the government monitors progress by collecting information bottom-up from all provinces, cities, minorities, industrial sectors, etc. Every 5 years, results are reviewed, new priorities are identified and decided top-down in terms of addressing critical issues at hand and reaching the long-term goals of establishing a modern socialist country by 2050. During the early 5-year plans, priorities were on establishing governance, economy, and culture. In 2007, social stability was the main topic, and environment was part of that for the first time, because the authorities realized that a clean environment was part of what a happy society expects. China started then systematically collecting information throughout the country on the environmental status of surface water, air, soil, etc. As became clear that the environment was in dire condition, the focus of the next 5-year plan in 2012 was put on environment. China started systematically mapping the impact of industry and cities on the environment to understand what had led to the poor environmental conditions. In 2017, as became clear that the environmental issue had become critical, while other critical issues had popped up at the same time, Xi Jinping stepped up, announcing the 3 critical battles against financial risks, poverty, and pollution. In 2018, China then changed its national constitution, aiming to become an eco-civilization. Now, before we go to the next slide, I want to make clear that with environment, I did not just mean cleaning up environmental pollution. It also included preventing new pollution, which meant that the industry had to be upgraded and cities needed to change. In reality, an industrial and urban transformation was envisioned. This is not a map of corona spreading, but a map showing the early days of the systematic implementation of new environmental policies province by province. China always first tests policies via pilots in different parts of the country before rolling them out nationally. You can see this in 2016 before they rolled out the 2017 5-year plan. Key to understand is that a pilot would lead to successful enforcement, as they understand that awareness needs to be grown and that changes in mindset are needed. During these early campaigns, focus was on government officials that needed to adapt to their new environmental KPI over the earlier KPI that focused on GDP. Clean air and rivers became equally or sometimes even more important than just GDP. Campaigns focused on identifying and punishing companies and officials who were causing environmental problems through illegal behavior. From these campaigns, the government learned that new enforcement tools were needed. In the past, companies would simply pay a minor fee instead of respecting environmental standards, because that simply was cheaper. Fines, however, were increased, and ceilings were removed. This meant that fines can be repeated on a daily basis until a non-compliance is solved. Legal representatives of the company were made personally liable, environmental crimes and liabilities were defined, and special instruments were installed allowing the local governments to restrict production or even halt operation of companies that are not complying with environmental regulations, or even, and this is very important to realize, even restrict production and halt operations if environmental KPI such as the air quality or river quality in their region is not meeting the objectives and if environmental problems are acute. This was a real paradigm shift in China. It went probably unnoticed for most people out of China, but not for companies in China. Companies in China for sure remember the sudden tough stance from the authorities on environmental governance, impacting their operations and more even so their supply chain. Now, what exactly are those two paradigm shifts? Transparency and public participation. There used to be a time in China that you better did not talk about environmental problems. It was considered a non-issue, and talking about it meant that you were a troublemaker. That changed 180 degrees. Companies now even are required to disclose their environmental compliance, and the information is made available online to the public. Civilians now increasingly can go online and check real-time the wastewater discharge and air emissions from major factories in their neighborhood. If the factory's emissions in water or air are exceeding standards, then the government is automatically notified and the public can see it too. The government then, in cooperation with the public and with endorsed NGOs, also started listing and driving cities in terms of transparency, and even issued environmental hotlines where civilians can report environmental issues. So basically, the government started engaging its population in raising the bar, identifying the issues, and exerting the governance. An example of what this led to is the case of 6 chemical companies in Taizhou City. They had contracted a hazardous waste vendor that disposed their waste acid illegally into a river. The population noticed something was wrong with the river and reported this to the authorities. Inspection was done, the waste vendor was fined, responsible people were imprisoned for environmental crimes, and both the vendor and 6 companies using the vendor were hit with a 160 million RMB litigation, which was initiated by a local NGO. As mentioned, many companies in China have faced challenges with environmental enforcement in China, even leading companies with good environmental management systems in place. That is because most companies currently have a gap in their system. They do not cover external factors such as surroundings and policies. Most get hit because of this reason. Surrounding refers to nearby factories, protected areas, local environmental infrastructure, nearby communities, and so on. For example, earlier in Kunshan, 270 factories were suddenly temporarily closed by the local government that was feeling pressure to meet river quality targets. Other examples of external factors are dynamic, for example, weather conditions leading to temporary poor air quality in nearby cities during high-profile events such as the Shanghai International Expo, both leading to temporary production curtailment for factories in the region. Even complaints from citizens following poor performance of other nearby factories can lead to local government initiatives affecting your operations. Policies refer to urban planning, environmental planning, industrial transformation, and capacity management, also industrial park upgrading, and so on. For example, in Hubei province, a list of 250 chemical companies was issued, Chinese and foreign, that were affecting the water quality in the Yangtze River Delta. All companies on this list were required to transform their operations. They got specific deadlines between now and 2025. Several provinces then and several cities then started issuing similar lists that address certain industrial sectors in certain parts of the country to address certain specific environmental issues. Also, for example, Shandong province, they issued a target to reduce the chemical industry with 20%. Several other provinces issued lists of companies that needed to upgrade or relocate. Exemption lists are also issued, and companies can check if they can meet the exemption criteria and apply for exemption. But in general, the central government has uttered the objective to close or relocate factories that are polluted, scattered, old, and messy, as they call them, all out of the urban landscape. This is in some way similar with what has happened in Europe and in the US over the last 30 years. So the pain most companies are facing is not related to the change, but to the speed of change. There is little time for transition. Many companies today still are not aware how their operations and suppliers are vulnerable to these external and dynamic factors, so they get hit. The challenge most companies face is that these issues are very dynamic, triggered unexpectedly by events, and often are happening all in parallel. In addition to government policies at national, provincial, and local level, other measures taken might be in parallel to address local acute problems following complaints or related to acute environmental pollution, such as poor environmental air quality, for example during the winter periods. Also, incidents such as an explosion or a virus outbreak can contribute to this, as I will illustrate in a minute. The key message, however, is that these initiatives are triggered by various local factors. They pressure different government departments to act on a variety of goals, sometimes confusing and conflicting. They all are very dynamic and in fact leading to adapting and implementing policies real time. Most companies have a risk management system with annual auditing. Every year, they review compliance and performance issues to be addressed by the next audit 1 year later. In China's dynamic context, this is not enough. First of all, external factors are not included in the audit. The system is unable to capture and address the dynamic factors which continue to happen throughout the year. And finally, some factors cannot be corrected simply because they relate to closures, relocations, or industrial upgrades. This sometimes makes companies with outdated operations no longer viable. Let's take the Jiangsu explosion from last year as an example. Notice how this explosion triggered a systematic wave of measures over the country. The initial local government communications were generally vague, with strong wordings about how the government would vigorously address the issues at hand and punish those who were responsible. These are messages from government officials under stress, knowing that they will get national inspections that will dig deeper into the root causes leading to the explosion. Once the root causes and the potential outfall with the population has been mapped, critical issues to be addressed are clear and are prioritized, and rectification programs then are orchestrated, first in Jiangsu province and soon all over the country. You can see how fast this escalated in just 12 days. The explosion, which had killed people and which made many people living close to factories worried, is turned into a strong central message to punish the culprits and to modernize the chemical industry as a whole. Because It's important to realize that the case is used not only to identify the specific problem that led to this explosion, but also to identify systemic issues, and that these are turned into a centrally organized systematic drive for an industrial upgrade. Critical issues, for example, address the fact that both the park and the company, from inspections 1 year earlier, already were known to have non-compliances, and that these likely contributed to the explosion. Critical issues, for example, address the fact that there was a suboptimal cooperation between various related government departments, such as the Department for Environment, the Department for Safety, and the Department for Emergency Response Planning. Critical issues also include the lack of awareness, insufficient procedures, and outdated industrial processes, and even planning issues such as distance to school, communities, and so on. From the specific communications that followed, you can clearly see how the government then de facto starts addressing the critical issues they prioritized. Companies known to have similar problems are blacklisted, licenses are cancelled, rectification programs then trickle down from provincial to local level, assessing and addressing those issues. They then become part of the systemic or systematic inspection program that I showed you earlier, and also in the local government improvement plans that work bottom up as well as top down. Let's now move via the present into the future. Finally, one slide on Greenment. Greenment is the largest environmental consultancy in China with satellite offices in Europe, Belgium, and the US. The company originated from a management buyout by the staff of the environmental engineering business unit of Jacobs Engineering in China. Greenment also developed the earlier mentioned online portal and serves both foreign and Chinese companies in and outside of China. Okay, we have reached the end of my presentation. If you are interested in the online portal or in green manufacturing, or if you want to hold a strategy workshop on how you can work with China in a better way, you can find my contact details here. I hope this presentation made you think and made you realize that it's your call to learn and surf on those waves. Thank you very much.